Hi guys, welcome back to my channel, The Determined Gardener. How are you doing today? This is the second part of my series, How to Take Care of Your Orchid. And you can see one of my beautiful orchids right here. I have had this beauty for about 8 months. That's right, 8 months, and it still has its petals, and that's because I really truly baby this baby. I take care of this orchid as much as I can. So I'm going to show you 3 things you can do to make sure that your orchids are healthy and thriving. I use Better Grow Orchid Better Bloom, and this is what I use once a month on my orchids. These beautiful orchids gets fertilized once a month. So you fill the cup with a gallon of water and you use this on your orchids at least once a month. Here's one of my orchids. Actually, it's one of my favorite ones because I love the color and the dotted features on the petals. So you can see one of the petals is about to fall off, but you can see the plant is really healthy. When the petals start to fall off, that means your orchid is going into hibernation period where it will rest so it can rebloom for you. And isn't that what we all want, right? So don't be alarmed when your orchid starts losing its petals. And that's very normal. It's in growth and rejuvenation cycle. The petals should fall off gradually. But if you see it one that's falling off every day, you should be alarmed and you should take care, because that could mean that you may be overwatering. It may be because you may be underwatering, or that you are giving your orchid too much sunlight. Standard watering is once a week for most people, but I find that sometimes that leads to overwatering, which could lead to soggy roots and even improper watering. Every 3 weeks, I water every 3 weeks as opposed to watering every week, because I feel like that will actually overwater the orchid, and you don't want that to happen. Typically, it's easier for an orchid to bounce back when it is in need of water than rather when it's actually watered too much, because when you water it too much, then it's going to be harder for it to bounce back, because then you create root rot and then you actually destroy the roots, and there's no way for the roots to bounce back. You can always give it more water when it's thirsty, but it's much harder to actually care for an orchid when it's experiencing root rot. And unfortunately, that's what happens a lot. People overwater these orchids and then they get soggy, their roots get bad, and you have to throw them out. So that's why, for me, I tend to water every 3 weeks. And I think that works for me. So before I go to my next tip, do me a favor and hit that sub button and that like button to let me know that you are enjoying this content and you're getting good information from it. So another tip that you guys, don't be fooled by a full bloom when you go into a big box store. Lots of these big box stores have these orchids on display with all the petals fully open. Well, you say, what's the problem? You don't know how long that orchid has been blooming in the store. Most likely, it's been there for quite a while, which means that when you get home and you're probably in love with that orchid, it's on its last bloom cycle, meaning that you'll have less time to enjoy the beautiful orchid. Instead, you want to look for an orchid that still has its buds and plenty of them, which means the orchid has started its bloom cycle instead of ending it, which means you'll have more blooming time instead of trying to get it to rebloom again, right? An example of what I'm talking about is this beautiful baby right here. It had 3 petals open, and the majority of the buds were just forming. And I've been able to enjoy this beautiful orchid for months now. Let's talk about cutting your orchid, right? You can remove the entire flower spike so that the orchid plant can put more energy back into the leaves and roots, helping it to grow stronger and produce a fresher new flower spike. But be sure to use sterilized pruner, shears, or scissors versus a knife, because this could damage your orchid if you use a knife, and it could really just mess up that spike altogether. So trimming orchid spikes during the cooler temperatures of the fall season is one of the best ways to encourage reblooming in future months. So the first time you cut an orchid can be really scary. I know that was for me. I was like, oh my God, what's going to happen? But trimming them really is the best thing to do. So you trim your orchid spikes, can be stressful, but don't worry, I'll walk you through it. Think of it as just giving your orchid a nice little haircut, right, to make it thicker and stronger. But again, before you start, make sure the shears or any cutting object you're using on your orchid is nicely sterilized. So for healthy green spikes, find a node under the lowest flower bloom, trim 1 inch above that node, and that's it. For brown spikes, and most of the time my spikes usually turn out brown, and I just leave them there. That's not a problem. The spikes can be brown. Cut it all the way back to the base of the plant. That way, if you're cutting it all the way back to the base of the plant, you will notice that a leaf will most likely form. When I leave my brown spikes up and I cut it all the way back, that gives the plant more energy, and all that energy goes to the big leaves that you see that are growing on your orchid. When I cut it on a node, that produces an actual flower bud spike, which creates a flower spike, which creates a flower bud. So if you want your orchid to produce more leaves, leave the spike on and let it get brown and cut it, right? If you want more buds, cut it down. Once it's still green, cut it down to a node, right? And then it will actually rebloom again with a new flower bud. It takes about a month or two, or even sometimes even several months for an orchid to rebloom. I'll show you one of the leaves that's growing. This leaf is getting bigger. The leaves that are oldest tend to fall off to make room for the new ones, so that's actually pretty normal. But if your orchid leaf that is falling off that's green, if it's still green, that means it's healthy. So you shouldn't worry. It's just a natural course of things, right? But if you do see yellow leaves, that means that the orchid is not being watered enough and the roots may die back and cannot take the water or nutrients in. So be careful of yellow leaves. That does not mean, again, you should overwater. Just water a little bit more consistently. And be sure to place your orchid in an area that they can see the sunlight, not be directly on the sunlight, because if you have them in direct sun, unfortunately, their petals will burn and you don't want that to happen. So take a look at the new growth on this orchid. The new leaves are healthy and green, and that's what you really want. You don't want any yellowing leaves, but if they do tend to yellow, that means sometimes that they are older leaves, and that's the natural aging process. So you shouldn't be too alarmed. But again, you really should be examining what your orchid looks like every day, because once you examine them and you're seeing, hey, something's happening, then you can respond more quickly. So trimming orchid spikes during the cooler temperatures of the fall season is one of the best ways to encourage reblooming in future months. So the one final note, you want to make sure that when you are changing temperatures for your orchid to stimulate them to grow, you don't want to put them in front of any open vents or any air conditioning unit that's just going to blast them with cold air, because that will lead to what's called a bud blast. And that's when all your buds, when they're nice and healthy, all of a sudden shrivel up on the orchid, and they will all just fall off. Some of the buds just shrivel up on the orchid plant itself and never falls off. It just shrivels up. So that's called bud blast. So you don't want that to happen. So that's an extra tip when moving your orchid to a cooler spot to get it to rebloom. Guys, thank you so much for joining me here on my channel, The Determined Gardener. For all of you guys who are wondering what type of orchid this is, I don't know the official name. I got it at the regular big box stores, just like the regular orchid. So it's just a generic orchid that I picked up. And you can see that it is still blooming nearly after 8 months. So again, if you got any helpful tips, don't forget to hit that sub button, give this video a like, and share it with your family and friends. Until next time, I'll see you in the next video. Bye-bye.